So our last speaker is Richard Roman, who's a professor emeritus at the University of Toronto, also an associate fellow of CERLAC and co-author of Continental Crucible, Big Business, Workers and Unions in the Transformation of North America, which is now in an expanded Spanish edition called La Gran Cazuela en América del Norte, Gran Capital, Trabajadores y Sindicatos en la Época del Villegas.
Thank you. How to start? I'm thinking of Francisco Madero, who was elected president of Mexico in 1910 after a 34, 36-year dictatorship. And there was an armed revolution that overthrew the dictatorship. And he, like Obrador, inspired tremendous hopes, though his program was more vague than Obrador's, really much more effective suffrage, municipal self-government, very without much social content. But he mobilized the hopes of many different forces, Zapatistas, workers, and part of the national bourgeoisie. But what ensued was a 7-year. First of all, let me backtrack. First of all, he inspired enough popular mobilization that he scared capital and conservative forces. But he also was not willing to build a movement that could resist because he himself was a liberal. Not like Obrador, who's what I would call a revolutionary nationalist in Mexican terms, and I'll come back to that. But he set up a situation where he disappointed popular forces, but did enough, rhetorically at least, to scare the conservative forces, and he fell in a coup planned by the British, US, and Mexican embassies with the Mexican army. It led to a 7-year civil war to overthrow the military regime, which was overthrown in about a 3-year period of armed struggle. But then there was a civil war within the revolution because there were radically different concepts of what was going to happen. Now, we're not in the situation, there was no armed revolution in Mexico, but there was a tremendous mobilization that people have described of popular forces. But there seems to also have been a coming together, or at least acceptance, by international capital, and even what López Obrador called the mafia of power, the top peak of the Mexican capitalist class, that they had to live with Obrador. Given the crisis, or we can't stop the election without uprisings, but so we have a situation that's very fluid and open, full of hope, as people describe, but also full of major obstacles. And not to be pessimistic, because I'm very excited about the possibilities that have been opened up. It's incredible, as people have indicated on the panel. But I also want to talk about some of the obstacles. The situation he will inherit. So I want to mention quickly 5 obstacles. One is that big business has tremendous power still. It has tremendous power to subvert the government in different ways, to create economic problems, either by feeling individually the companies, the climate of business is bad, or by a capitalist strike, removing investment, not buying bonds, etc. Business still has tremendous power. The U.S. has tremendous power over Mexico. It has many levers of power. And the drug lords have, in alliance with local and regional political leaders, have tremendous power. They control big portions of Mexico that are really not under the control of the national government. He also inherits the straitjacket of NAFTA, and whether it's revised or not, it will be still a straitjacket. He has said clearly he accepts NAFTA, and he accepts the proposals that have been proposed so far by the outgoing neoliberal government. Again, his beliefs again, perhaps trying to assuage the worries of business in the U.S. The other thing that he inherits that hasn't been much talked about is a tremendous fiscal crisis of the state. If there's time, I can talk about that a little more. There's a tremendous fiscal crisis of the state that has been pushed over to now by irresponsible borrowing on the part of the previous governments of the last 10, 20 years. And now with interest rates edging up, the crisis is going to get worse. So I think Anna's point about the left winning when there's a crisis, inheriting a crisis, is a classic problem of the left and creates the great dilemma of left or semi-left governments of, do they deepen the crisis by fighting capital, or do they assuage capital and disappoint their base, or to try to find some middle ground? I think Obrador is going to try to walk a tightrope between assuaging capital and making reforms. And some of the reforms he will try to make, and he's talked about, are tremendously important, even though they're not going to change the fundamental structural inequality of power. I mean, if you can do something to end the terror of the violence, the state violence and so on, that's tremendous. If you do something about human rights. But let me now jump to Obrador's political tradition. Obrador's political tradition is one in Mexico. It's called revolutionary nationalism. It comes out of the Mexican Revolution and the left wing of the former ruling party until the neoliberal era. And revolutionary nationalism was never, even from the start, if you look at the constitutional debates, which I studied for my dissertation 200 years ago. If you look at the constitutional debates, which are a little over 101 years ago, even the most left-wing sections of them are saying, what we want to do is create an equilibrium between capital and labor. We don't like selfish capitalism. That term was used again and again. It's just like the mafia of power. We don't like the mafia of power, but we're not anti-capitalist. We don't like selfish capitalism, but we need a strong state to regulate and tame and control capitalism. So this is, I think, the balancing act that Obrador and that the Mexican regime, until really the 40s, it shifted, tried to do. Even under the Cardenas era in the 30s, where the most radical and some of the most wonderful reforms happened, the oil nationalization, the radical land reform, giving land to peasants and indigenous communities in communal forms, and other things, was accompanied by a very careful management to try to prevent workers and peasant power from being too independent and challenging the boundaries of the project of state-guided capitalist development with a human face. Now that wasn't the neoliberal era, and that wasn't the era where much of the state was controlled by, regions were controlled by drug laws. There's reason to think that his strategy initially in his battle against corruption and his battle against the loss of central state power is going to focus on not only ending the drug war, but defeating the cartels. And defeating the cartels and reasserting federal power over state governments. So he's already announced a very important action that is very controversial to the right in Mexico, that he is going to appoint one federal coordinator to represent him directly in each state. Right now, to control federal funding. Right now, federal every major department in the federal government has its representative in each state. It allows a lot more maneuvering and manipulation of power of the state government. He wants to really shape up the state governments and assert control through financial levers over state governments. And he wants to diminish or abolish the power of drug laws. But in that emphasis, which is going to be a very, very tough battle, some people are speculating that he doesn't want a multi-front war. This is a huge war, and he's going to need U.S. acquiescence or support. And he's going to need, and he can't afford a war with big capital at the same time. That's the argument that some people that I've been talking to have been making. And it's very plausible. It's a very sensible strategy from the point of view of the new government, because to take on to take on big business if you wanted to take on the energy companies, take on the drug laws at the same time, would be a recipe for defeat and overthrow. On the other hand, that strategy has very serious consequences. He can make some ameliorative reforms that don't cost money. He can make some ameliorative reforms that don't cost a lot of money. But there isn't a basis for making major restructuring of income if you don't attack the rights of capital. So for example, one of the reasons for the financial crisis in Mexico is there's several reasons, but the tremendous drop in oil revenues because of the neoliberal governments letting the oil industry run down, not letting it modernize, invest. They're going to try to change that. But meanwhile, all the revenues have dropped tremendously, and taxation for the rich is almost non-existent for corporations. He has run, in his campaign, in his platform, he was clear. No new taxes on anybody. That he was going to get money for his social programs through downsizing government, through rationalizing government, through ending corruption and some of the high salaries. Well, some of those things are very good things to do, but he's not going to get a heck of a lot of money. So he's going to be in a jam as to where he's going to get the money to carry out reforms. The other thing I want to jump to from talking about his relationship to the capitalist class in the U.S. state is the actor that gets very little discussion because it's not a dramatic actor for a long time in Mexico, but is very important. I'll call it the sleeping giant, with the hopes that it's going to wake up. The Mexican working class. There's a common image outside of Mexico that Mexico is a rural and indigenous country, and it is to a degree. And the indigenous and rural areas are really important in terms of, if we could use such soft language, the soul of Mexico, the traditions of Mexico. But they're the sectors where there's been most brutalized by neoliberalism, and where there've been the most dramatic fightbacks against the assault of neoliberalism and the drug areas. But it's a minority sector in Mexico. Mexico is an overwhelmingly urban and working class, or proletarian if you want, country. Mexico's urban, 82% of Mexicans live in urban areas. The comparable figure for the U.S. Mexico is 80%. Canada and the U.S. are 82%. Mexico is as urban as the U.S. and Canada. In terms of wage or salaried workers, slightly less than the U.S. and Canada, but growing more rapidly as a proportion. Almost 70%, almost 70% of the workforce, of the population, work for wages or salaries. And the labor movement has not been a significant actor since the 30s, except for moments and certain exceptions. Moments 1958, there was a big uprising that was violently repressed. The teachers' movement since the 70s, the dissident teachers' movement is very dynamic. There's occasional local battles, but the working class as a whole has been very passive. Quickly, some of the reasons for that is the old system of labor control, the remnants of a state-controlled labor regime, compulsory arbitration. The second reason is the relocation of most industry from the center, where there were unions, although many of the unions were corrupt and vague, but there were unions, to the north. What's happened with Mexican domestic industry is they moved to the north to avoid unions, the same reason U.S. industries moved to the U.S. South and to Mexico. And most of those places have ghost unions, phantom unions they call it, protection contracts, and just outright repression. The other thing is a lot of the new industry is in narco-controlled areas. The border region of the maquilas is in areas of the drug trade. The people, working class in those areas, live in an area of terror, state terror and private terror. So if Obrador can open, as someone talked about, I think it was Cohen, about the opening up of space. If he can open up the space, it's a great moment for reorganization. And I just want to mention one thing. His cabinet is very contradictory. I mean, he's appointed to key economic posts, pro-business people. Just one more word. But he's appointed to Secretary of Labor a 30-year-old woman, Luisa Maria Alcalde Lujan, who is the daughter of the two leaders of FAT, Authentic Labor Front, which is a movement, left movement for democratic unions that's been around for about 30 years. And the FAT people have been having meetings with all kinds of democratic unions to develop and propose a labor reform. So there may become an opening for worker mobilization, but it will take some time to develop. So we're in a tremendously fluid situation that's very hopeful, but fraught with obstacles and dangers.